The first thing I noticed wasn't the broken stone fireplace. It was the silence. The kind of silence that settles over a place after something sacred has been violated. Then I looked toward the dock my grandfather built with his own hands back in the late 60s, and half of it was floating in the lake like driftwood. That's when I realized somebody hadn't just vandalized my family cabin. They'd held a party there, laughed while they destroyed it, and somehow convinced themselves they'd never answer for it. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 55 years old, and for almost 15 years I've owned a small cedar cabin on Black Alder Lake in northern Wisconsin. When people hear the word cabin, they imagine some fancy vacation house with a hot tub and giant windows overlooking the water. Mine wasn't anything like that. It leaned just enough that you could feel the floor complain every winter. The porch squeaked no matter how many times I replaced the boards. The kitchen still had handmade cabinets my grandfather built after coming home from serving as sheriff of Pine Ridge County. Every scratch on those walls had a story behind it. Every stone in that fireplace had passed through his hands. He always told me a man didn't inherit land. He borrowed it from the people who loved it before him. I never really understood what he meant until that Friday evening. I had spent the week in Madison finishing a training conference for work and decided to drive up before sunset, thinking I'd spend the weekend fishing, fixing a loose railing, maybe finally replacing the old weather vane that had been crooked for years. About 2 miles from the property, I noticed tire tracks cutting across the old access road. That wasn't unusual during hunting season, but it was July. Then I saw empty beer cans lying in the ditch. Again, strange, but not enough to make me worry. It wasn't until I stepped out of my truck that my stomach dropped. The front gate had been ripped off the hinges. My grandfather's carved wooden sign had been snapped clean in half and tossed into the weeds. Music wasn't playing anymore, but there were still disposable cups rolling across the yard every time the wind picked up. The front door stood wide open. Inside looked like a tornado had decided to stop for a drink. Chairs overturned, cabinets hanging open, plates shattered across the floor. Somebody had spray-painted a smiley face on the stone chimney. My grandmother's quilt had muddy boot prints across it. The family photo albums, every single one, had been piled into the fire pit outside and burned almost completely to ash. I remember kneeling beside what was left of one photograph. Half my grandfather's face had survived the flames. The other half was gone forever. Funny thing about grief, it doesn't always arrive as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as absolute stillness. I didn't yell. I didn't punch a wall. I just stood there breathing slowly while my brain quietly started putting pieces together. Whoever did this hadn't stumbled onto the property by accident. They knew nobody was coming. They stayed for hours, maybe longer. Then I noticed fresh tire marks leading toward the neighboring subdivision controlled by the Maple Glen Homeowners Association. I'd dealt with them before, not because my cabin belonged to the HOA. It didn't, but because several board members had spent years trying to pressure me into selling. They wanted my shoreline to connect 2 private beaches into one continuous waterfront development. Every offer got bigger. Every refusal seemed to make them angrier. About 20 minutes later, a silver SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Sandra Whitlock, the HOA treasurer, wearing expensive sunglasses despite the sun already dropping behind the trees. Her son Kyle climbed out behind her holding a coffee, like he'd just stopped by to admire landscaping instead of a crime scene. Sandra glanced around with barely enough concern to qualify as polite. "Oh, looks like things got a little wild." A little wild. Those were the exact words she used while looking at 30 years of family memories reduced to ashes. Before I could answer, she pulled a folded envelope from her purse. "Actually, Ethan, since our maintenance crew had to remove trash from the shared access road after your guests left, the association voted to assess you $2,800 in emergency cleanup costs." I honestly thought she was joking. Then Kyle laughed. "Come on, man," he said, shrugging. "That old shack's fallen apart anyway. Somebody finally got some use out of it." He looked straight at the broken fireplace and smirked. "Besides, dead people don't need lake views. There are moments in life when everything inside you wants to explode, and somehow you become calmer instead." I looked at both of them for several seconds before asking one simple question. "You sure that's the story you want to stick with?" Sandra smiled without hesitation. "Absolutely." Kyle crossed his arms. "You got any proof otherwise?" I nodded once, slipped the envelope into my pocket, and quietly thanked them for stopping by. They both looked confused, almost disappointed. I think they expected screaming, maybe threats. Instead, I watched them drive away, waited until their taillights disappeared around the bend. then reached into my truck and unlocked the black case I almost never brought to the cabin. Inside was my county-issued badge. You see, Sandra and Kyle thought they were dealing with a quiet, middle-aged guy who visited an old fishing cabin a few weekends every summer. What they didn't know, what almost nobody around Black Alder Lake knew, was that I'd spent the last 32 years working my way up through law enforcement until becoming sheriff of Redstone County. And before I ever made my first phone call, I already had a feeling this wasn't going to end with vandalism charges. The first call I made wasn't to one of my deputies. It wasn't to the state police. And it definitely wasn't to Sandra. I called the dispatcher back in Redstone County and asked her to put me in touch with Detective Aaron Mills, a guy I'd trusted for nearly 20 years because he had one habit that made him exceptional. He never assumed anything. I told him I needed a favor off the clock, just another set of experienced eyes before I started making official notifications. 45 minutes later, he was standing in my kitchen holding a flashlight, carefully stepping around broken glass while I photographed every inch of the cabin. "This wasn't random," he muttered, kneeling beside the fireplace. "They took swings at the stones on purpose." He was right. If somebody wanted to steal electronics or vandalize a vacation house, they wouldn't spend time knocking apart a stone fireplace that had stood for decades. They wanted to erase something. We walked outside and found tire tracks leading behind the garage where someone had attempted to spin donuts in the grass. Empty liquor bottles were lined up along the dock railing like trophies. Aaron suddenly stopped and pointed toward a security camera tucked beneath the eaves. I'd almost forgotten about it. 3 years earlier, I'd installed 4 discrete cameras after someone stole my fishing boat battery. They weren't obvious unless you knew where to look. Better yet, the recordings automatically backed themselves up through a cellular connection because internet service at the cabin was unreliable. I opened the app on my phone, and there they were, every single second. Around noon the previous Saturday, Kyle unlocked my side gate using a copied key. That surprised me. Around 12:15, the first SUVs arrived. By 1 o'clock, nearly 20 people were carrying coolers, folding tables, portable speakers, and cases of alcohol onto my property like they'd rented it for the weekend. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody acted like they were trespassing. Then the camera caught something even more interesting. Kyle stood on my porch welcoming guests while saying, "Welcome to Black Alder Executive Escape. Best networking weekend in northern Wisconsin." Executive Escape. That wasn't just a party. It was a business event. Guests laughed, shook hands, exchanged business cards, and several of them walked up to Kyle handing him envelopes before scanning a QR code taped beside the front door. Aaron looked over at me. "You hear that?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, paid admission." Suddenly, this wasn't only criminal damage. It was commercial activity. Illegal commercial activity on private property. We downloaded every video before either of us touched another thing. Then I opened Kyle's public social media accounts. Some people think arrogance is loud. It isn't. Arrogance is believing you don't have to hide evidence because nobody can stop you. Kyle had uploaded dozens of photos throughout the weekend. One video showed him standing on my dock, raising a glass while yelling, "Who needs permission when you've got confidence?" Another featured people dancing on top of my grandfather's handmade picnic table until one leg snapped clean off. The final clip made Aaron whistle under his breath. Kyle was recording himself throwing another log into the fire pit while saying, "Old family junk makes great kindling." Behind him, my grandmother's photo albums were burning. If this ever reached a jury, the defense would have almost nothing to work with. Still, something bothered me. Sandra hadn't looked worried when she handed me that invoice. She acted like she genuinely believed she couldn't lose. That kind of confidence usually comes from paperwork, so instead of filing charges immediately, I drove Monday morning to the Pine Ridge County Register of Deeds. A woman named Melissa had worked there for almost 25 years, and she smiled the second I walked in. "Sheriff Caldwell," she said. "Still refusing to retire?" "Trying my best," I laughed. "Can you pull every document connected to Parcel 214D me?" She disappeared into the archives while I waited. 10 minutes later, she rolled out a cart stacked with folders thicker than a phone book. We spent nearly 2 hours reading easements, surveys, old tax maps, shoreline agreements, and transfer deeds dating back to the 1940s. That's when Melissa paused. "You probably forgot this one," she said, sliding a certified copy across the desk. I hadn't forgotten. I just hadn't needed it until now. 5 years earlier, after discovering that my grandfather had been the first elected sheriff in Pine Ridge County and had personally organized search and rescue teams that saved dozens of lives over 4 decades, I'd quietly worked with the Wisconsin Historical Society to nominate the cabin for state historical recognition. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about tourism. I simply didn't want developers tearing it down after I was gone. The application took almost 18 months. Multiple inspections, architectural reports, historical verification, and public hearings. Eventually, the cabin received official state landmark protection. A year later, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places because of its connection to regional law enforcement history. I never advertised it. I never put up a sign. I figured people who respected property didn't need reminding, and people who didn't probably wouldn't care. But the law cared. A lot. Melissa looked at me over her glasses. If someone knowingly damaged protected structural elements, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I thanked her, collected certified copies of every document, and walked outside feeling something shift inside me. Up until that moment, I'd been thinking like a grandson. Now I had to think like a sheriff. Tuesday morning began with another surprise. Aaron called while I was driving back toward the cabin. "You might want to look at this." He texted me screenshots from Kyle's event website. The registration page was still active. 18 attendees had each paid $350 for what Kyle described as an exclusive leadership retreat on a private lakeside estate. There were testimonials from previous events, cancellation policies, and a payment processor linked directly to his business account. Sandra wasn't listed publicly, but Aaron had subpoenaed basic transaction records through a judge he knew from another investigation involving fraud. Sandra's personal account had received $1,800 labeled venue support. She'd been paid for letting her son use someone else's property. We started making a timeline. Saturday, illegal entry. Saturday afternoon, paid business retreat. Saturday night, destruction of protected property. Sunday morning, cleanup. Sunday afternoon, fabricated HOA invoice delivered to the victim. It wasn't just vandalism anymore. It looked like conspiracy, fraud, and possibly tax violations depending on what had been reported. At exactly 8:30 Wednesday morning, I called the Wisconsin Historical Preservation Office. By 9:15, an investigator agreed to inspect the site personally. At 10, I met Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Sloan, someone I'd known since she was fresh out of law school. She listened without interrupting, occasionally writing notes in the margins of my report. When I finished, she leaned back and said something I'll never forget. "Ethan, most property crimes end with repair estimates. This one starts there." Around lunchtime, another unexpected visitor pulled into the driveway. It was my elderly neighbor, Walter Briggs, carrying an old coffee thermos and walking slower than I remembered. He looked around the property for several minutes before speaking. "Your granddad arrested me once," he said. I blinked. "Really?" Walter laughed. "Yep, 1973. Caught me racing my truck through town. He could have thrown the book at me, but instead he made me repaint the community center for free." He stared at the broken fireplace. "Best punishment I ever got. Taught me responsibility." Then his face hardened. "Those kids didn't just damage a building. They insulted a man who spent 40 years protecting this county." Before leaving, Walter handed me something wrapped in an old towel. It was one of the original iron fireplace tools my grandfather had given him decades earlier while rebuilding Walter's house after a storm. "Thought these belonged back here." Sometimes justice isn't fueled by anger. Sometimes it's fueled by memory. Thursday morning, the preservation investigator completed her inspection. Her report was devastating. Structural heritage damage, irreplaceable masonry displacement, destruction of documented historical artifacts, intentional vandalism supported by digital evidence. She looked directly at me before getting into her state vehicle. "Sheriff, once this report is filed, I can't slow it down." I nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." Less than an hour later, I made one final phone call, not because I wanted revenge, but because every piece of evidence now pointed toward money changing hands that nobody seemed eager to report. The agent at the Regional Financial Crimes Office listened quietly as I explained the paid retreat, the online registrations, the transfers, and the videos. He thanked me, requested copies of everything, and ended the conversation with 6 words that made me realize Sandra and Kyle still had no idea how quickly their world was about to collapse. "We'll take it from here." What neither of them knew was that by the time Sandra proudly walked into the next HOA board meeting, 3 separate government agencies had already opened independent investigations, and none of them were talking to each other yet, which meant every new discovery was about to hit them like another avalanche before they'd even recovered from the first one. Everything unraveled faster than I expected. The following Tuesday, search warrants were served at Kyle's house, Sandra's office, and the HOA headquarters within the same morning. Historical preservation investigators, financial crime agents, and county officials all arrived independently, each carrying their own stack of evidence. Kyle's confidence disappeared the moment they started carrying computers and financial records out of his house. Sandra stood in her driveway demanding answers, but nobody was interested in arguing. They simply handed her the warrants and continued their work. Over the next few weeks, every investigation uncovered another problem. Kyle's so-called leadership retreats had generated thousands of dollars in unreported income. Sandra had accepted payments for allowing those events to take place on property she didn't own, then tried to bill me for cleaning up the damage they caused. What began as vandalism quickly turned into tax investigations, zoning violations, and fraud inquiries. The strongest evidence wasn't collected by detectives. It came from Kyle himself. His own videos showed guests paying to attend the event, laughing while damaging the cabin, and burning my family's belongings. In court, those same clips that once earned likes online became undeniable evidence. Eventually, Sandra asked to meet with me. She looked exhausted, nothing like the confident woman who had handed me that ridiculous cleanup invoice only weeks earlier. She offered to repay every dollar, resign from the HOA, and cooperate with investigators if I could somehow stop the case. I quietly told her the truth. This stopped being my decision the moment the evidence reached the prosecutor. Justice no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the system she thought she'd never have to face. Kyle eventually accepted a plea agreement, paid substantial restitution, performed court-ordered community service, and faced years of probation. Sandra resigned before the HOA removed her, and the association hired independent auditors to review its finances. Ironically, many of the same neighbors who once pressured me to sell my cabin volunteered to help rebuild it. We reconstructed the fireplace stone by stone using old family photographs, replaced the dock, and restored everything as faithfully as possible. Before winter arrived, the state approved a long-term preservation order that permanently protected the property from future interference. The day I sat alone on the rebuilt dock, looking across the same lake my grandfather had loved for decades, I realized this had never been about revenge. It was about protecting a family's history from people who believed money and influence placed them above respect and responsibility. They saw an old cabin. I saw generations of memories. In the end, that made all the difference. So what do you think? If someone destroyed your family's legacy, would you have confronted them immediately? Or would you have stayed patient and let the evidence do the talking? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really like to hear where you stand. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that real justice doesn't come from anger. It comes from truth.